August 15th, 717 AD. You're standing on the walls of Constantinople, watching 1,800 warships, carrying over 100,000 warriors, surround your city. You have 20,000 defenders. The greatest empire on earth, stretching from Spain to India, has mobilized the largest invasion force the medieval world has ever seen to destroy you. Every military calculation says you die within months. Every probability says your civilization ends. Every expert says surrender now, and maybe they'll let some of you live. August 15th, 718. Exactly 1 year later, the Byzantine chronicler Theophanes claimed only 5 ships made it home. Modern historians call that exaggeration. But every source, Christian and Muslim alike, agrees what happened wasn't a battle. It was annihilation, one of history's most catastrophic military disasters, and the survival of a civilization that should have been extinct. This is the siege of Constantinople, and this is the story of how 20,000 men defended by lies, fire, winter, and volcanic eruptions defeated 100,000 warriors who thought God had promised them victory. By the end of this story, you'll understand how a usurper emperor who betrayed his allies months earlier organized a defense that saved Western civilization, why Arab chroniclers called this siege the disaster of disasters, how a technological secret weapon made water itself burn, why one of history's most severe winters struck at exactly the moment defenders needed it. But first, you need to understand the deception, because in 716 AD, a full year before the siege began, a Byzantine general named Leo did something so audacious, so brilliantly dishonest, that it would define everything that followed. He was surrounded, outnumbered, apparently trapped in a fortress called Amorium, with no hope of escape. The Arab general Maslama, the sword of Islam, a man who'd never lost a battle, demanded surrender. So Leo rode out personally to negotiate. Using his fluent Arabic and knowledge of frontier customs, he made an extraordinary offer. Help me overthrow Emperor Theodosius III. I'll hand you the Byzantine Empire as a tributary. I'll give you Constantinople without a drop of blood spilled. Maslama, intrigued by the prospect of bloodless conquest through a puppet emperor, agreed. He pulled his cavalry back to allow Leo's men to gather grain from surrounding fields, ostensibly to hand over as tribute. What Maslama didn't realize until too late was the direction. Leo wasn't taking grain out of the fortress to give to Arabs. He was moving grain into the citadel from the countryside. While Arabs waited for supplies, Leo stockpiled Amorium for an extended siege. Once every last bushel was safely behind walls, he sent Maslama a message. I lied. Come take it if you can. The Arab general had been played. The man who'd promised to hand over an empire had instead secured a massive stronghold in Maslama's rear, stocked for a year-long siege. The fortress that should have surrendered was now impossible to take without weeks of effort and thousands of casualties. Maslama was forced to bypass Amorium, leaving a fully garrisoned Byzantine fortress sitting astride his supply lines. It was strategic disaster, born of trusting the wrong man. But it was also something more personal. The sword of the caliphate had been humiliated by a frontier general using the oldest trick in warfare. 3 months later, Leo marched on Constantinople and seized the throne. When Maslama heard the news, his calculation shifted. This wasn't just conquest anymore. This was vengeance. The liar would pay. By summer 717, Arab forces were gathering for what they believed would be the final conquest, the largest army the Islamic world had ever assembled. The fulfillment of prophecy, the fall of the city of Caesar. They had no idea that the liar emperor had more tricks ready, that secret weapons, catastrophic weather, unexpected allies, and the worst volcanic disaster in centuries would combine to create the impossible. 100,000 warriors thought God fought on their side. They were about to discover that sometimes cunning counts more than counting. To understand how impossibility became reality, you need to see how catastrophically broken the Byzantine Empire was in 717 AD. This wasn't a confident civilization preparing for heroic defense. This was a dying empire that had accepted its own extinction. For 22 years, the Byzantine state had torn itself apart. 7 emperors, 7 violent regime changes, 0 stability. Historians call this the 20 Years' Anarchy, and Byzantine chronicler Theophanes described an empire convinced their sins had brought divine punishment in the form of relentless Arab expansion. The numbers tell a horror story. Great fortresses that once dominated the landscape were falling one by one. The Umayyad Caliphate commanded an empire stretching from Spain to India, resources beyond comprehension. They could field over 100,000 warriors. The wealth of Egypt funded endless campaigns. Arab generals had spent decades conquering Byzantine territory with methodical efficiency. Constantinople's nobles made secret preparations for exile. Ships waited in ports. Treaties were quietly negotiated with potential protectors. The smart money said the kingdom had months at most. Emperor Theodosius III occupied a throne he barely controlled, watching the empire crumble without apparent power to stop it. Byzantine sources describe a people who believed they were watching the end of their world. But something else was stirring on the frontiers. A rough soldier from the borderlands was playing a game far more dangerous than anyone in Constantinople's gilded halls could imagine. His name was Leo, born around 685 inches, Commagene on the Syrian frontier, originally named Conon. He came from humble origins that left no mark in historical records until his military brilliance forced chroniclers to notice. What made Leo dangerous wasn't just tactical skill, it was intimate knowledge of the enemy. Decades on the Arab-Byzantine frontier had given him something few Byzantine nobles possessed. He spoke Arabic fluently, understood Arab culture deeply, knew their military psychology from the inside. Medieval sources describe him as a master of metis, that Greek concept of cunning intelligence that values the indirect approach over brute force. This wasn't a traditional hero. This was a trickster figure who won through deception when strength failed. Think about his position in early 717. He was strategos of the Anatolikon theme, military governor of one of Byzantium's most critical defensive zones. He just humiliated Maslama at Amorium through pure cunning. And he was watching Emperor Theodosius III prove utterly incapable of defending the empire. In March 717, as Maslama's invasion force gathered in Syria, Leo made his move. He marched on Constantinople not to defend it from Arabs, but to seize it from the emperor. The usurpation was swift and bloodless. Theodosius, perhaps recognizing he lacked strength to resist, or perhaps simply exhausted by the burden of ruling a dying empire, retired to a monastery without a fight. On March 25, 717, Leo was crowned emperor in the Hagia Sophia. The coronation must have seemed surreal to Constantinople's elite. This rough soldier emperor from the borderlands, only 32 years old, standing where emperors of ancient lineage had stood, wearing purple his hands had quite literally stolen. Byzantine sources describe him as having the bearing of a frontier general, not the refined manners of court. He would wear imperial regalia, but his demeanor remained martial, practical, focused. What the nobles watching that coronation didn't know, what would only become clear in months ahead, was that Leo had already been playing a far more dangerous game. He had negotiated with the very army now marching toward their gates. He had made promises to Maslama, and he had absolutely no intention of keeping them. The emperor, who saved Constantinople through lies, had just told his biggest lie yet, seizing the throne while the greatest army on earth marched toward the walls. In 5 months, those walls would be surrounded. and everyone would discover whether Leo's cunning was genius or fatal miscalculation. Facing this cunning usurper stood the most successful Muslim general of his generation, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, brother of the Caliph, governor of Mesopotamia, the man Arab sources called the Sword of the Caliphate. Historical records document a resume that would intimidate any opponent. Born around 685, the same time as Leo, but into circumstances of unimaginable privilege. His father was Caliph Abd al-Malik. His brother was the reigning Caliph Suleiman. He governed Mesopotamia and Armenia, commanding the loyalty of Syria's military elite. Arab chronicles describe decades of victory. The capture of Tyana in 708, the sack of Amasya, the systematic dismantling of Byzantine defenses across Anatolia. This was a general who had never known defeat. Byzantine and Arab sources agree on Maslama's reputation. He wasn't just competent. He was the premier military commander of the Umayyad state. Byzantine fortresses that had held for generations fell when Maslama arrived. His very name could empty garrisons. But historical analysis suggests Maslama carried something more dangerous than mere confidence: prophetic belief. Islamic tradition held that the conquest of Constantinople was divinely ordained. Historians examining the period note that Maslama appears to have believed his name was associated with that prophecy's fulfillment. This wasn't just military ambition. This was sacred destiny. The campaign he prepared for in 717 reflected that conviction. Contemporary sources document mobilization of resources on an unprecedented scale. This wasn't a raid, one of the seasonal incursions that had harassed Byzantine borders for decades. Arab historians make clear this was a grand campaign designed for permanent occupation. The Caliphate was preparing to decapitate the Byzantine Empire and absorb Europe into the Islamic world. The numbers are staggering. Estimates range from 80,000 to 120,000 warriors drawn from across the entire Islamic Empire. The core consisted of 30,000 to 40,000 Syrian Arabs elite troops whose loyalty to the Umayyad dynasty was unquestioned. Supporting them were Mawali, non-Arab converts, including Persians and Berbers, along with contingents from every province of the Caliphate. This wasn't simply a large army. Military historians examining the period emphasize this was a cosmopolitan war machine, representing the full might of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. These were warriors who had conquered from Spain to India. They wore armor, influenced by both Byzantine and Sasanian traditions. Heavy mail hauberks, often reinforced with lamellar, conical or rounded helmets, frequently wrapped in turbans, straight double-edged swords, rather than the curved scimitars of later periods. They carried the confidence of men who believed God fought on their side. But the land forces were only half the terror. Contemporary sources, both Christian and Muslim, cite 1,800 ships assembling in the eastern Mediterranean. This fleet represented perhaps the largest naval mobilization of the medieval period. Heavy transport dhows from Egypt, capable of carrying months of supplies. War galleys, designed to dominate sea lanes. Supply vessels packed with everything an army would need for an extended campaign. The crews numbered in the tens of thousands, drawn primarily from Egypt and North Africa. Critically, as would later prove decisive, many of these sailors were Coptic Christians who had been forcibly conscripted into service. They rowed and sailed under compulsion, not conviction. Byzantine sources describe the supply train stretching for miles behind Maslama's advancing columns. This wasn't logistics of a seasonal raid. This was preparation for permanent occupation. The Caliphate had emptied its treasury for this campaign. The quantities involved suggested confidence in a siege that might last years if necessary. Damascus was betting everything that Constantinople would fall. By late summer, 717, as Maslama's endless columns began their march, Every military calculation pointed to the same inevitable conclusion. The city would fall. The numbers were overwhelming. The supplies were adequate. The leadership was proven. The prophecy was clear. But calculations don't account for deception, technology, or winter. And Constantinople possessed all three. Constantinople wasn't just a city. It was the new Rome, protected by God according to Byzantine sources, and its defenses were as much spiritual as physical. Archaeological evidence and historical records document defensive works unmatched in the medieval world. The Theodosian walls, constructed in the 5th century, had never been breached in over 300 years. This wasn't merely military propaganda. It was verifiable fact that shaped the psychology of both defenders and attackers. The walls consisted of a triple defensive system, a 60-foot wide moat, a low outer wall, and a massive inner wall, studded with 96 towers. These weren't just stone barriers, they were a statement of invincibility that had withstood every siege for 3 centuries. Geography reinforced what engineering had built. The city occupied a triangular peninsula, surrounded on 3 sides by water. The Golden Horn protected the northern approach. The Bosphorus guarded the east. The Sea of Marmara secured the south. Only from the west could a land army approach, and there the Theodosian walls stood unbroken. Any naval assault would have to contend with treacherous currents and Byzantine naval supremacy in waters they'd controlled for centuries. Byzantine engineering sources describe one defensive feature that would prove critical: the Great Chain of the Golden Horn. This was no ordinary chain. It consisted of massive iron links, each the size of a man's forearm, supported by wooden pontoons floating on the water's surface. The chain stretched from the Tower of Eugenius on the Constantinople side to the Tower of Castellion in the suburb of Galata. Teams of men operated windlass mechanisms that could raise the chain to block entry or lower it to allow friendly ships passage. When raised, it transformed the Golden Horn into an impregnable safe harbor. When lowered, it became a gateway Byzantine forces could exploit. But Theophanes makes clear the defenders believed their ultimate protection was divine, not merely physical. The city had survived for over 3 centuries, not simply because of walls and chains, but because God willed it. Icons of the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, were paraded along battlements as spiritual weapons. Contemporary sources describe Constantinople in 717 as a theocracy in a fortress, where constant prayer vigils in the Hagia Sophia created an atmosphere of apocalyptic piety. The people believed their survival depended as much on the Virgin's favor as on their soldiers' swords. The contrast between Byzantine and Arab worldviews was absolute. Both sides believed God fought for them. Both saw this conflict in cosmic terms. Theophanes records Byzantine conviction that their walls had never fallen because divine protection made them unconquerable. Arab sources reveal Islamic confidence that their expansion had never failed because Allah's will drove them forward. In August 717, as Maslama's endless columns appeared on the horizon like a storm made of men and steel, these two theological certainties would collide. The golden mosaics of Constantinople glittered behind massive limestone walls. Beyond them stretched an ocean of Arab tents, siege engines, and confident warriors. The arithmetic said the walls would fall. History said they never had. Faith said God would decide. One of these convictions was about to shatter. But before the siege could even begin, Leo had one more surprise. A weapon so terrifying, so technologically advanced, that Arab warriors would call it hellfire made manifest. A secret so closely guarded that the formula remains lost even 1,300 years later. Greek fire. And in September 717, Maslama's fleet was about to discover why Byzantine sailors whispered that it could make the sea itself burn. August 15th, 717 AD. Theophanes records the moment Maslama's army arrived at Constantinople's land walls as a vision from the apocalypse itself. The visual confrontation was staggering. Contemporary chronicles describe an endless sea of Arab tents filling the horizon, siege towers being assembled, mangonels positioned for bombardment, the banners of Islam, white Umayyad standards, mixed with colors of a dozen provinces stretched as far as defenders on the walls could see. Behind limestone barriers, Constantinople's golden domes caught the August sun. The contrast embodied the clash: Christian civilization's greatest city versus the Islamic world's mightiest army. Maslama's initial strategy was conventional. Historical accounts document assault attempts using ladders and battering rams against the western walls. Byzantine defenders positioned along towers and battlements repelled these probing attacks with archery volleys and stone throwers. The assaults served their purpose. They tested defenses and confirmed what military logic had already suggested: the Theodosian walls could not be taken by force. Medieval siege warfare had well-established protocols for this situation, and Theophanes describes Maslama following them with professional competence. Recognizing that assault was futile, he ordered construction of circumvallation defensive siege works that would strangle the city through starvation rather than storm it through violence. The engineering was sophisticated. Arab forces constructed a double line of walls and ramparts outside Constantinople. One line faced the city to prevent sorties by defenders. The other faced outward to defend against external relief forces. This was textbook Roman siegecraft, and it demonstrated that Islamic military engineering had absorbed and mastered the techniques of their Byzantine enemies. The circumvallation would cut off land supply routes, while the fleet still days away would complete the blockade by severing sea lanes. Maslama settled in for a patient siege. His army, supplied by the wealth of the entire caliphate, could wait months or even years. The camp that sprang up outside the walls became a city unto itself, with markets, mosques, and vast corrals for thousands of animals. Contemporary accounts suggest a confidence bordering on certainty. The siege works were built to last. The supplies were adequate for an extended campaign. Time, hunger, and inevitability would accomplish what assault could not. Inside the walls, Leo faced a calculation that would have broken most commanders. Without resupply, the city had perhaps weeks of food. The Muslim fleet would arrive any day to complete the stranglehold. The land routes were already cut. Simple arithmetic suggested Constantinople would starve long before Maslama's well-supplied army showed any signs of weakness. By nightfall on August 15th, the siege works were begun. Maslama had demonstrated textbook military professionalism. He'd tested defenses, recognized their strength, and adapted to a strategy that leveraged his overwhelming advantages in numbers and supplies. His army could wait months. Constantinople could not. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The city would starve. But Maslama had made one critical miscalculation about the Bosphorus, and it would cost him everything. Because on September 1st, when 1,800 Arab ships sailed past Constantinople into the Bosphorus to cut off the city's Black Sea grain supply, they encountered something for which no training, no experience, no prophecy had prepared them. A weapon that violated everything they knew about warfare. A substance that made water itself burn. A technological terror that Byzantine sources described with a mixture of precision and awe. Greek fire. And what happened 48 hours later would become the stuff of nightmares that Arab sailors would describe for generations as the day they watched the sea catch fire and their comrades swim through flames. September 1st, 717. The Arab fleet, 1,800 ships, according to both Byzantine and Muslim sources, sailed past Constantinople into the Bosphorus to cut off the city's Black Sea grain supply. What happened 48 hours later would shatter the largest naval force ever assembled in the medieval world. Theophanes provides detailed accounts of the fleet's arrival. These weren't just war galleys. The Arab armada included heavy transport deos built for carrying supplies, war galleys designed for combat, and support vessels for an extended campaign. The sheer scale, modern historians debate exact numbers, but sources consistently cite 1,800, represented perhaps the largest naval force assembled in the medieval period up to that point. The Arab admirals made a fatal tactical error that contemporary sources document with clarity. Unfamiliar with the treacherous currents of the Bosphorus, they allowed their heavy ships to drift too close to the city walls near the Acropolis point. The vessels became clustered and immobile. Their crews, assuming they were safely out of range of Byzantine defenses, positioned themselves to blockade the strait, cutting off Constantinople's access to Black Sea grain. The strategy was sound. The execution would prove catastrophic. Leo III seized the moment. Byzantine sources record him ordering the Great Chain of the Golden Horn lowered. Teams working the windlass mechanisms allowed the massive iron barrier to sink beneath the surface. A squadron of Byzantine dromons, specialized warships designed for speed and maneuverability, rowed out from the protected harbor into open water. Arab crews, trained in Mediterranean naval warfare, expected a boarding action. They prepared for the clash of ships, hand-to-hand combat, the familiar brutal chaos of naval melee. What they faced instead was something for which no training or experience had prepared them: Greek fire. Byzantine sources described the weapon with a mixture of technical precision and awe. The dromons mounted bronze siphons on their prows, tubes through which a liquid substance was pumped under pressure. Heated by braziers at the nozzles, the liquid ignited as it sprayed, creating a coherent jet of flame that could reach 10 to 15 meters. Modern theories suggest the composition involved naphtha, quicklime, sulfur, and resin, though the exact formula remains a lost Byzantine state secret. The effect on the clustered Arab ships was immediate and catastrophic. Theophanes records 20 massive Arab transports incinerated in the attack. But the true horror lay in Greek fire's properties. The substance was sticky, like modern napalm. It floated on water, and water didn't extinguish it in many cases. Water spread the flames across the surface of the sea. Think about that for a moment. You're an Arab sailor. Your ship is on fire. You jump overboard to escape the flames, but the sea itself is burning. The substance clings to your skin, burning with a black, oily smoke that chroniclers say could be seen for miles. Contemporary accounts describe Arab sailors jumping into water only to find themselves swimming through fire. The screaming, the smell of burning flesh and pitch, the sight of the sea itself aflame. Sources on both sides record this as a vision of hell made real. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. Arab naval commanders had never encountered anything like this. Their experience included decades of Mediterranean warfare, battles against Byzantine fleets, knowledge of every conventional naval tactic. But this violated everything they knew about combat. Fire that water couldn't quench was beyond nature, beyond warfare, beyond comprehension. The surviving Arab ships scattered in panic. Theophanes documents them retreating to Sozopolis on the European shore, well away from the city's reach. The fleet that was supposed to complete the blockade had been shattered before it could establish control of the strait. The strategic consequence was immediate and profound. The Bosphorus remained open. Constantinople could still receive grain from the Black Sea. The city that should have been strangled now had a lifeline. Meanwhile, Maslama's land forces, cut off from their own naval supply line, faced an ironic reversal. The besiegers were becoming isolated, while the besieged maintained supply. December 717 brought what Theophanes called a winter of unnatural cold. Modern climate studies confirm it. The winter of 717 to 718 was one of the most severe in recorded European history. For the Byzantines behind their walls, it was providence. For Maslama's army, it was the beginning of hell. Contemporary sources document weather that seemed apocalyptic. Snow covered the ground for over 100 days, extraordinary for a region where winter snow typically melts within days. Temperatures plunged far below normal for the Mediterranean climate. The records describe conditions so severe that the Bosphorus itself began to freeze, a phenomenon so rare that it stood as evidence of divine intervention in Byzantine minds. The frozen strait created surreal and terrifying scenes. Ice floes from the Black Sea clogged the waterway. Massive chunks of ice smashed into ships and seawalls. Byzantine sources describe soldiers walking on the ice, an image that captured the unnatural severity of the cold. Modern climate researchers examining the period suggest possible volcanic activity, creating atmospheric dust that contributed to the extreme temperatures, what scientists call a volcanic winter. Whether divine punishment or natural catastrophe, the effect on the siege was undeniable. For Maslama's army, the winter marked a descent from confidence into desperation. Arab supply lines through Anatolia, already stretched thin across hundreds of miles, came under increasing harassment from Byzantine raiders who knew the terrain. The naval supply route, compromised by Greek fire and now further complicated by ice and winter storms, couldn't deliver adequate provisions. The camp that had seemed so well supplied in August faced shortages by December. Theophanes provides a detailed chronicle of the famine's progression that modern historians debate as possibly exaggerated but fundamentally accurate. The first phase saw the systematic slaughter of transport animals. Arab warriors ate their camels first, the beasts that had carried supplies across deserts from Egypt to Syria. The meat was tough but sustaining. When the camels were gone, they consumed their horses. Arab cavalry, the elite of Islamic military might, watched their mounts being butchered for food. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't just animals. They were the warriors' companions, their tactical advantage, their pride. After the horses came the donkeys, every pack animal that had survived the march. By late January, contemporary accounts document an Arab camp that had consumed every large animal. The sounds of the siege had changed. No longer the clang of weapons being maintained or the bustle of a confident military encampment. Now it was the desperate chopping of frozen wood for fuel, the wailing of sick men, the silence of those too weak to make noise. Inside Constantinople, the contrast couldn't have been starker. Byzantine sources don't describe starvation in the city, a telling silence that speaks volumes. The advanced infrastructure that had sustained the capital for centuries continued to function. Massive cisterns like the Basilica cistern held thousands of cubic meters of fresh water brought by aqueducts from the Belgrade forest. Even if aqueducts were cut, stored water could last for years. The Bosphorus, despite the ice, remained partially navigable. Ships still brought grain from the Black Sea through the strait. Roman traditions of hygiene, maintained through public baths and water distribution systems, helped prevent the disease outbreaks that typically ravaged besieged cities. Morale inside the walls was sustained by religious fervor and adequate supplies. The constant prayer vigils continued. Icons were paraded daily. The people believed they were witnessing divine protection made manifest. Every day the Arab army grew weaker, while Constantinople maintained its strength, seemed to confirm what faith had promised. God protected his city. By late January, the Arab camp had consumed every camel, every horse, every donkey. Medieval sources document what happened next, with descriptions that test the limits of credibility. Yet the desperation was undeniably real. When the meat ran out, men would eat things that should never be eaten. What Theophanes records next tests the limits of human endurance and historical credibility. The Byzantine chronicler, writing decades later, described scenes so horrific that modern historians actively debate whether they're literal truth, propaganda, exaggeration, or some combination. What's not debatable is that Arab sources themselves admit the catastrophe. even as they spare the gruesome details Theophanes provides. Chronicles document the next phase of starvation with details that shock even across 13 centuries. With all large animals consumed, Arab warriors turned to whatever could be found. They ate plant roots dug from frozen ground. They consumed old leather saddles, boots, anything made from hide was boiled until it could be chewed. Water mixed with sawdust, and any scrap of organic matter became a gruel that provided calories if not nutrition. Then, according to Theophanes' account, came the unspeakable. He claims bodies of the dead were consumed. Modern historians debate this as possible propaganda exaggeration, designed to emphasize Arab suffering and Byzantine divine protection. Yet the claim appears in sources and reflects the extreme desperation of the situation. The most horrific allegation, that excrement was mixed with leaven to make a substance resembling bread, may represent Byzantine propaganda at its most lurid, but it served to communicate the absolute collapse of normal human society in the Arab camp. What's verifiable beyond chronicle accounts is the disease outbreak. Medieval medical history shows that cold, combined with malnutrition, creates conditions for catastrophic pestilence. Theophanes records dysentery, what medieval sources called the bloody flux, killing thousands of men. Exposure claimed as many lives as disease. Historians examining siege warfare patterns confirm this matches typical conditions. In medieval sieges, disease and starvation killed far more than combat. The burial crisis added horror to horror. Frozen ground made digging graves impossible. Contemporary sources describe bodies being stacked in ravines or simply left in the open where they fell. The winter snow preserved the corpses, hiding the full scale of death until the spring thaw would reveal the graveyard the camp had become. The stench, normally overwhelming in a medieval military camp, was frozen along with everything else. But come spring, the decomposition would poison the air and water sources that remained. Arab chroniclers, when they address this period at all, use euphemism and theological interpretation. They speak of hardship sent by God to test faith. They admit massive suffering without providing the visceral details that Byzantine sources relish. The difference in tone suggests truth lies somewhere between Theophanes' lurid propaganda and Arab reticence. The camp experienced catastrophic conditions. Whether every specific horror occurred exactly as described is uncertain. That tens of thousands died is not. Inside Constantinople, life continued with relative normality that must have seemed miraculous to those who watched from the walls. The cisterns provided clean water. The grain ships from the Black Sea, though reduced in number by winter and ice, still arrived. Disease remained minimal because Byzantine infrastructure maintained basic sanitation. Morale stayed high because every day that passed demonstrated divine favor. The Virgin's protection wasn't just theological claim, it was visible reality. By March 718, Maslama had lost more men to winter than to any battle in his career. Contemporary sources suggest tens of thousands dead, though exact figures are impossible to verify. His invincible army had become a graveyard with standards. Any reasonable commander would have retreated months earlier. The sunk costs were irrelevant compared to the living disaster the siege had become. Yet, Maslama stayed. Was it the prophecy he believed connected his name to Constantinople's conquest? The sunk cost of so much death making retreat psychologically impossible? Fear of facing the caliph with the greatest military disaster in Islamic history? Sources don't tell us his reasoning. What they do tell us is that in spring he would make one final desperate gamble to salvage victory from catastrophe. It would backfire with devastating completeness, because in May 718, when salvation appeared in the form of 760 relief ships carrying food and fresh warriors, betrayal from within would turn hope into ashes. Spring 718 brought what looked like salvation for Maslama's dying army. Theophanes records the arrival of two massive relief fleets, 400 ships from Alexandria, 360 from North Africa, carrying food, weapons, and hope. Within weeks, that hope would turn to ashes, betrayed from within. The numbers tell the story of caliphal commitment. 760 additional ships represented an enormous mobilization of naval resources. Contemporary sources document these vessels, carrying desperately needed supplies, grain from Egypt's fertile Nile Delta, weapons from Damascus's armories, fresh warriors to replace the tens of thousands lost to winter. The relief expedition suggested that, despite the catastrophe, Umayyad leadership remained committed to Constantinople's conquest. Critically, the crews manning these ships were largely Coptic Christians who had been forcibly conscripted from Egypt. This detail, documented in both Byzantine and Arab sources, would prove decisive. The Copts were Christians who had lived under Islamic rule since the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century. While generally treated with the tolerance Islamic law required for people of the book, they remained second-class subjects. Forced naval service was one of the burdens their communities bore. The fleet commanders, wary of Greek fire after the September disaster, exercised tactical caution that Theophanes describes in detail. Rather than sail directly to Constantinople, where Byzantine dromons could attack, the ships anchored on the Asian side of the Bosphorus, hiding in protected bays near Nicomedia. This positioning kept them well away from the city's reach, while allowing them to eventually ferry supplies to Maslama's camp via protected routes. What happened next, according to Byzantine sources, was an act of religious solidarity that shattered Arab hopes. Under cover of darkness, Coptic sailors seized the ship's small boats, the skiffs and light craft used for ship-to-shore transport. Chronicles record them rowing across the Bosphorus under night's concealment, approaching Constantinople's sea walls and hailing the imperial guards with shouts that Theophanes preserves. Long live the emperor! Think about what this meant. These Coptic sailors, pressed into service against their will, saw fellow Christians defending their city against Muslim conquest. Religious identity trumped forced loyalty, and they made a choice that would doom tens of thousands of their captors. The defectors brought intelligence that proved invaluable. They revealed the exact location of the hidden Arab supply fleet in the Nicomedia bays. They described the ship's positioning, the number of vessels, the level of alertness among the guards. They provided navigation details for reaching the Asian shore through waters Byzantine sailors knew well, but that would be treacherous in darkness without local knowledge. Leo III moved with the speed that had characterized his entire reign. Byzantine sources document him arming his dromons with Greek fire and assembling crews for a night attack. Guided by the Coptic defectors who knew precisely where their former fleets lay at anchor, the Byzantine squadron crossed the strait to the Asian side. The Arab supply ships, stationary and unprepared in what their commanders had believed was a safe anchorage, faced the same horror their main fleet had experienced in September. Greek fire turned night into day, and the sea into an inferno. Theophanes records the systematic destruction of the relief fleet, the supplies meant to save Maslama's army grain that could have fed them for months, weapons to replace those lost or damaged, fresh provisions for men who'd been eating roots, and worse, were sent to the bottom of the sea or consumed by flames that water couldn't quench. The psychological impact rivaled the material loss. Maslama had endured winter's horror with the knowledge that relief was coming. Spring would bring salvation. The new supplies would reverse the catastrophe. Fresh troops would restore fighting capability. The siege could continue with renewed strength. Instead, he watched from the European shore as flames rose once again from the Asian side. First his main fleet in September, now his relief fleet in May. The Caliphate had sent nearly 2,600 ships to Constantinople. Greek fire and betrayal had destroyed them. As summer heat replaced winter cold, In July 718, Maslama faced a new crisis. Khan Tervel of Bulgaria, given the title Caesar by Byzantium decades earlier, had decided Constantinople's survival served Bulgarian interests. Historical records document what happened when steppe warfare met exhausted siege lines. The Bulgarian alliance had deep roots. Byzantine sources record that in 705, Tervel had helped deposed Emperor Justinian II regain his throne. As reward, he'd been granted the title Caesar Kaisar in Greek, making him the first foreign ruler to receive this honor. This meant Tervel considered himself part of the imperial hierarchy, not simply a barbarian outsider. When Leo negotiated for help in 718, he was appealing to an established, if complicated, relationship. Tervel's motivations were pragmatic rather than ideological. Historical analysis suggests he recognized that an Arab victory would make Bulgaria the next target. Constantinople's walls had stopped Islamic expansion. If those walls fell, nothing stood between Maslama's army and Bulgarian territory. The trade concessions Leo offered were attractive, but survival dictated involvement regardless of payment. The Bulgarians brought a warfare style completely different from the siege combat that had dominated the previous year. Bulgarian military studies document them as a steppe, people with Turkic roots, masters of mobile warfare, swift horse archers who could appear, strike, and vanish before heavy infantry or siege troops could respond. They wore lamellar armor and heavy furs, carried composite bows of devastating power, and rode under horsetail standards that marked their Central Asian heritage. Theophanes describes their campaign with admiration for tactical acumen. The Bulgarians did not attack Maslama's main siege lines head-on. That would have been suicide against fortified positions manned by professional soldiers. Instead, they used their mobility to ambush foraging parties. Any group of Arab soldiers sent to find food or fuel in the countryside became targets for swift cavalry attacks. More devastatingly, Bulgarian horse archers cut off the rear of Maslama's camp. The Arab forces found themselves in a trap of their own making. In front stood Constantinople's impregnable walls. Behind, Bulgarian cavalry controlled the countryside. The siege lines designed to starve the city had become a prison for the besiegers. Think about what this meant tactically. You're an Arab soldier. Winter has already killed tens of thousands of your comrades. You've eaten your horses, your camels, things you can't bear to remember. Greek fire has destroyed your fleet twice. Now, every time you leave camp to find food or firewood, Bulgarian arrows come from nowhere. You can't chase the attackers. They're mounted, you're on foot. You can't predict where they'll strike. And you can't survive without foraging. The casualty figures from this phase show the effectiveness of the Bulgarian campaign. Western chronicles claim 300,000 total Arab casualties for the entire siege, a number modern historians recognize as impossible exaggeration. But scholarly analysis of the Bulgarian intervention specifically suggests 22,000 to 30,000 Arab dead from these attacks alone represents a credible estimate. These weren't casualties from single battles, but cumulative losses from weeks of constant harassment, ambushes, and the cutting of supply lines. Arab sources, when they address this period, convey a sense of nightmare made real. Men who'd survived winter starvation now faced mounted archers who struck without warning. Foraging became a death sentence. The camp that had already suffered unimaginable losses bled more with each day. Morale, already shattered by winter, and the burning fleets collapsed entirely. Contemporary accounts suggest this was the breaking point. Winter had weakened the army. Greek fire had destroyed their fleets. But the Bulgarians made clear that even if Maslama somehow took Constantinople, his forces lacked the strength to hold it or retreat successfully. The military situation had become untenable. By early August 718, Maslama's once mighty army was broken. Of the 100,000-plus warriors who'd arrived in August 717, perhaps 40,000 remained alive, and most of those were sick, starving, or demoralized. Arab chroniclers admit the disaster's scale even as they spare the details. The numbers tell a story no amount of theological interpretation could soften. On August 15th, 718, exactly 1 year to the day after the siege began, Maslama gave the order his pride had resisted for months: retreat. But the worst was yet to come, because the journey home would kill more men than the entire siege combined. August 15th, 718, exactly 1 year to the day after the siege began, Theophanes records Maslama giving the order to withdraw. The largest invasion force the medieval world had assembled was retreating in ruins. But the nightmare wasn't over. The journey home would become an apocalypse that makes the siege look merciful by comparison. The land retreat through Anatolia added casualties to an already catastrophic toll. Byzantine forces, emboldened by victory and eager for vengeance, harassed the withdrawing columns at every opportunity. Arab sources describe a nightmare march where sick and exhausted men struggled through territory controlled by an enemy that showed no mercy. Think about what this retreat looked like. Men too weak to carry weapons, soldiers with frostbite, dysentery, wounds from Bulgarian arrows, no horses to ride, they'd been eaten months ago. No supplies, everything had burned with the relief fleets. Just the slow, agonizing march eastward through hostile territory, where every Byzantine garrison wanted blood for a year of siege. The exact casualties from this phase aren't documented with precision, but chronicles make clear the army that had marched so confidently westward a year earlier now stumbled eastward as a broken remnant. The naval disaster would prove even more complete. The remaining Arab ship sources don't specify exact numbers, but suggest substantial survivors from the various Greek fire attacks sailed south through the Aegean Sea toward Syria. They hoped to escape the terror of Byzantine fire weapons and reach the safety of home ports. Instead, they sailed into natural catastrophe. Theophanes records a massive tempest striking the fleet near the Cyclades Islands. Medieval ships dependent on favorable winds and lacking modern navigation equipment were particularly vulnerable to sudden storms in the Aegean's island-scattered waters. The storm alone scattered ships and sent many to the bottom. Wooden vessels designed for Mediterranean summers faced waves that could snap masts and swamp decks. Crews exhausted from a year of siege work lacked the strength to manage ships in crisis conditions. But nature wasn't finished. Contemporary sources describe an underwater volcanic eruption near the island modern geography knows as Santorini. Theophanes' account provides vivid details that sound almost apocalyptic, but are verified by geological evidence. Pumice and ash choked the water, making navigation impossible and breathing difficult. The chronicler claims the water boiled around ships caught in the volcanic turbulence. Falling embers from the eruption set wooden vessels on fire. Ships that had survived Greek fire died from natural flames. Volcanic gases poisoned the air. The turbulence from underwater explosions capsized ships that had survived the initial storm. The combination of storm and volcanic eruption created an apocalyptic scenario that both Christian and Muslim sources interpreted as divine judgment. The sky darkened with ash. The sea itself seemed to burn and boil not from Greek fire this time, but from the earth's fury. Ships caught in this catastrophe had no chance of escape. Theophanes makes his most controversial claim about the aftermath. Only 5 ships made it back to Syria. Modern historians consider this figure hyperbolic, likely Byzantine propaganda designed to emphasize the catastrophic scale of Arab losses. What's not debatable is the overwhelming consensus in sources from both sides. The vast majority of the fleet was destroyed. Whether 5 ships or 50 survived is almost irrelevant compared to the scale of loss. Think about what that means. 1,800 ships in the original fleet, 760 ships in the relief fleets, nearly 2,600 vessels total committed to this campaign. And according to the most conservative estimates, fewer than 100 made it home. More than 95% of the largest naval force ever assembled in the medieval world simply vanished, destroyed by Greek fire, winter storms, and volcanic eruption. Arab chroniclers writing later had to grapple with explaining this disaster. How could the largest naval expedition in Islamic history simply vanish? Theological explanations dominated. This was divine punishment for sins, a test of faith, a sign that the time for Constantinople's conquest had not yet come. The alternative, that military planning had been inadequate, that strategic errors had compounded into catastrophe, that human decisions had led to this disaster, was too painful to confront directly. The numbers, debated though they are, tell a story of annihilation that shocked both Christian and Muslim worlds. Modern historians, examining all available sources, suggest the Umayyad Caliphate committed perhaps 200,000 men to this campaign, when counting both land and naval forces. Theophanes and Arab sources agree on the essential conclusion: fewer than 30,000 made it home alive. Think about that ratio. More than 85% casualties. That's not a defeat. That's the destruction of a generation of Islamic military power. When Maslama arrived in Damascus in late 718, he brought fewer than 20,000 survivors from the army that had numbered 100,000. Arab chronicles, usually circumspect about defeats, couldn't hide the disaster's scale. This was a political earthquake. Theophanes and Arab sources agree on the image that symbolized Maslama's humiliation. He had fled the battlefield on a racing camel rather than a warhorse. In military cultures where appearance and symbolism mattered intensely, this detail was devastating. Warriors who fled on pack animals didn't inspire loyalty. The sword of the Caliphate, the general who'd spent decades conquering Byzantine fortresses, who had seemed invincible, returned to Damascus, broken in reputation as well as force. The political fallout was immediate and severe. The Caliphate's prestige had been catastrophically damaged. The largest army the Islamic world had ever assembled had been annihilated. The treasury had been emptied. Funding this expedition, contemporary sources document massive expenditures on supplies, ships, weapons, and pay for troops. All of it was gone with nothing gained. The military weakness that had been exposed was as damaging as the material losses. The Umayyad Caliphate, which had seemed invincible in its expansion, had proven vulnerable. A critical detail that Theophanes records helps explain why the disaster unfolded as it did. Caliph Sulayman ibn Abd al-Malik, who had ordered the grand campaign, died in September 717 during the siege itself. His successor, Umar II, was less personally committed to Constantinople's conquest. This change in leadership during the critical winter months may have contributed to decision-making paralysis. Maslama couldn't retreat without orders, but the new caliph wasn't providing clear direction. The result was an army that stayed in place through conditions that should have prompted immediate withdrawal. The Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing later but drawing on earlier sources, provided an assessment that Muslim historians couldn't dispute. He called the siege the disaster of disasters. Another chronicler wrote simply, "The year that destroyed faith." These weren't just military assessments, they were theological crises. Islamic expansion had been understood as divinely ordained. Prophecies had promised Constantinople's conquest. How could this catastrophe align with divine will? The theological questions rippled through Islamic intellectual circles. If God willed Islamic expansion and the conquest of the city of Caesar, why this disaster? Some scholars suggested unknown sins had caused Allah to withdraw favor. Others proposed this was a test that would strengthen faith through suffering. Still others began to question whether certain prophecies had been properly understood. The defeat raised uncomfortable questions. that would influence Islamic strategic and theological thinking for generations. The failure to conquer Constantinople, seen as divinely ordained, created cognitive dissonance that Islamic sources struggled to resolve. The largest military effort in the caliphate's history had resulted in near total destruction. Theologically committed leaders had to reconcile faith in divine destiny with empirical catastrophe. The intellectual and spiritual crisis matched the military disaster. Within a generation, the Umayyad dynasty would fall. The Abbasid Revolution in 750 AD, just 32 years after the siege, would sweep Maslama's family from power. While multiple factors contributed to the dynasty's collapse, historians examining the period consistently note that the Constantinople disaster played a significant role. It demonstrated weakness. It emptied the treasury. It killed a generation of Syrian Arab elites who had been the dynasty's military foundation. The reverberations from those winter months outside Constantinople helped topple an empire. In Constantinople, there was only celebration and theological questions of a different kind. When news of the Arab retreat reached Constantinople's streets in August 718, Theophanes records church bells ringing for 3 days straight. The city that should have fallen had survived. Byzantine sources describe celebration that mixed religious ecstasy with sheer relief. 3 days of bells marked the victory. Prayer services in the Hagia Sophia drew crowds that filled the massive structure to capacity. Processions through the streets carried icons of the Virgin Mary, thanking the Theotokos for her divine protection. The psychological release after a year of existential dread was immense. Constantinople had looked into the abyss and survived. Leo's political position was transformed overnight. The usurpation that had seemed desperate in March 717 now looked like divine providence. Victory legitimized his seizure of power completely. Questions about whether he had rightful claim to the throne were erased by the incontrovertible fact that under his leadership, Constantinople had survived the greatest threat in its history. Byzantine political chronicles document his consolidation of power as he founded the Isaurian dynasty that would rule until 802. Military prestige was restored after decades of defeats. The Byzantine Empire, which had seemed to be in terminal decline during the 20 Years' anarchy, had demonstrated it could still defend itself against overwhelming odds. The victory had multiple fathers: Greek fire technology, the severe winter, Bulgarian intervention, Coptic defection, Arab mistakes. But Leo claimed credit for all of it. His tactical acumen in exploiting the Coptic intelligence and launching the decisive Greek fire attacks couldn't be denied. The material gains from the siege were substantial, if not precisely documented. Theophanes mentions vast amounts of abandoned Arab equipment captured after the retreat: siege engines, weapons, armor, camp supplies. While sources don't provide detailed inventory, the sheer scale of the Arab abandonment suggests significant material windfall for the defenders. But the theological interpretation of victory created complications that would haunt the empire for a century. Byzantine religious tradition credited the survival to the Virgin Mary's divine protection. Icons of the Theotokos had been paraded on the walls. The faithful had prayed before sacred images, and Constantinople had survived. To the devout, the causal relationship seemed obvious. Yet in the years following the siege, the empire continued to experience catastrophes. Earthquakes struck multiple cities. Volcanic eruptions in the region, including the Thera eruption that had destroyed the Arab fleet, suggested ongoing divine wrath. If God had saved Constantinople, why did natural disasters continue to punish the empire? Theophanes' chronicles from this period show Leo wrestling with this cognitive dissonance. The emperor's solution would prove as divisive as the siege had been unifying. By 726, just 8 years after the siege, Leo initiated the iconoclast controversy. He concluded that the veneration of religious images, the very icons that had been credited with saving Constantinople, was actually idolatry that angered God. Byzantine theological sources document his reasoning. God had saved the city despite the icons, not because of them. The continuing disasters proved divine displeasure with image worship. The iconoclasm that followed would split the Byzantine Empire in religious civil war for over a century. Leo's religious policy turned supporter against supporter, created theological rifts that lasted generations, and arguably did more damage to Byzantine unity than any external enemy. The emperor who saved Constantinople from military destruction would tear it apart through theological innovation. Historical irony operated on multiple levels. Leo had saved Constantinople and Christian Europe. His tactical genius, Greek fire deployment, Bulgarian alliance, and exploitation of Coptic defection had achieved the impossible. But as emperor, he faced troubling questions about divine favor and human destiny. Within 8 years, this theological puzzle would split his empire in a religious civil war that lasted a century. The siege was over. Its consequences were just beginning. And those consequences would reshape not just the Byzantine Empire, but the entire trajectory of Western civilization for the next 1,000 years. Modern historians rank the siege of Constantinople 717 to 718 among history's most decisive battles, not just for what happened, but for what didn't happen. To understand why, we need to see the 3 civilizations this siege created, destroyed, and preserved. The Byzantine Empire's survival ensured it continued as Western Europe's shield for 700 additional years. Scholarly consensus emphasizes this role. Byzantium absorbed Islamic military pressure that would otherwise have been directed at the developing kingdoms of Western Europe. The empire preserved Greek learning and Roman law through centuries when Western Europe lost access to classical knowledge. This cultural preservation enabled the later Renaissance, when Byzantine scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest in 1453 brought Greek texts to Italy that Western Europe had forgotten. Military historians calculating the strategic implications note that Maslama took 10 years to rebuild a force comparable to what he lost in that single year. The defeat bought time Byzantium desperately needed. It demonstrated that the seemingly unstoppable Islamic expansion could be halted. It proved that technological superiority and tactical innovation could overcome numerical disadvantage. For the Umayyad Caliphate, the disaster accelerated internal contradictions that would prove fatal. Islamic history documents how the defeat destabilized the dynasty, politically and economically. The empty treasury couldn't fund subsequent military operations. The loss of a generation of Syrian Arab warriors, the dynasty's military foundation weakened its ability to suppress internal dissent. Arab sources from the period show provincial governors questioning Damascus's competence. Rivals sensed weakness. Just 32 years later, in 750 AD, the Abbasid revolution swept the Umayyads from power. While multiple factors contributed to the dynasty's overthrow, historians examining the period consistently identify the Constantinople catastrophe as a significant accelerating factor. The military disaster demonstrated vulnerability. The economic drain prevented recovery. The theological questions about divine favor undermined legitimacy. The greatest military expedition in Islamic history had ended in annihilation, and the dynasty never fully recovered. The strategic shift in Islamic expansion following the siege reshaped world history, with Constantinople proving impregnable and the Mediterranean approach blocked. Islamic focus moved eastward. The Abbasid capital would be Baghdad, not Damascus. Islamic civilization would develop its golden age, looking toward Persia and Central Asia, rather than toward Europe and the Mediterranean. The westward expansion that had seemed inevitable in 717 never again threatened Europe on comparable scale for 7 centuries. For Western Europe developing in comparative isolation, Constantinople's survival proved decisive. Even though most Europeans at the time barely knew the siege had occurred, the consequences were profound. The Carolingian Empire could consolidate without facing Arab invasion from the east, as well as pressure from Islamic Spain in the west. The Balkans and Central Europe remained Christian, rather than coming under Islamic rule. Western Christianity preserved its distinct identity rather than being absorbed into a Mediterranean-spanning caliphate. The alternative history scenario is stark. If Constantinople had fallen in 718, Maslama's army, or what remained of it, would have held the greatest naval base in the world and a direct land route into the Balkans. Nothing comparable to the Theodosian walls protected the developing kingdoms of Central Europe. The Byzantines had held that barrier for centuries. Without it, Islamic expansion could have proceeded into territory with no defensive infrastructure capable of resistance. Scholarly analysis consistently emphasizes this battle's macro-historical importance. It ranks alongside Tours in 732 and Vienna in 1683 as one of the decisive engagements where Islamic expansion into Europe was halted. Some historians argue it was more strategically significant than Tours because Constantinople's fall would have opened far more territory to immediate conquest. Western civilization sheltered unknowingly behind Byzantine walls would continue its development, and history would record that, sometimes, cunning counts more than counting. The siege proved enduring lessons about warfare that military academies still study. Let's break down what makes this battle eternally relevant. Lesson 1. Technology can trump numerical superiority. Greek fire demonstrated that secret weapons can rewrite strategic calculations. Arab commanders had never encountered anything like it. Their experience included decades of naval warfare, but this violated everything they knew. Fire that water couldn't quench wasn't just tactically superior, it was psychologically devastating. One technological advantage negated the numerical superiority of 1,800 ships. Lesson 2. Intelligence and defection can be decisive. The Coptic betrayal destroyed Arab hopes as effectively as any weapon. Religious solidarity trumped forced loyalty. The intelligence those Coptic sailors provided exact locations, ship positions, navigation details, turned the relief fleet from salvation into ashes. Modern military doctrine recognizes that winning hearts and minds isn't just propaganda, it's strategic necessity. Forcibly conscripted troops are liabilities, not assets. Lesson 3. Nature plays no favorites. The winter of 717 to 718 and the volcanic eruptions killed without regard to faith or righteousness. Both Christian and Muslim sources interpreted these events as divine judgment. They just disagreed on whose. Modern analysis sees environmental factors that operate independently of human will. But the tactical reality remains. Armies that don't account for weather, terrain, and natural disasters lose regardless of their size or skill. Lesson 4. Alliances matter more than armies. Bulgarian intervention delivered the final blow that made Maslama's position untenable. Tervel's horse archers didn't outnumber the Arabs, they didn't need to. Mobile warfare against exhausted siege troops cut supply lines, ambushed foragers, and turned the besiegers' camp into a death trap. Strategic alliances can be more valuable than additional divisions. Lesson 5. Morale and supply determine outcomes as much as combat. Constantinople maintained both, while the besiegers lost both. Inside the walls, adequate food, clean water, religious fervor, confidence. Outside the walls, starvation, disease, demoralization, theological crisis. The siege wasn't decided by who had more soldiers. It was decided by who could sustain those soldiers physically and psychologically. Lesson 6. Deception works. Leo's grain deception at Amorium in 716 set the stage for everything that followed. Maslama trusted the wrong man at the wrong time, and it cost him a critical fortress stocked for siege. The lesson that ancient commanders knew, and modern strategists still teach: verify everything. Trust requires validation. Deception is a weapon as deadly as any sword. Lesson 7. Sunk costs can kill. By March 718, any rational commander would have retreated. The winter had killed tens of thousands. The fleets were destroyed. Supply lines were cut. But Maslama stayed, possibly because retreating meant admitting the greatest military disaster in Islamic history. Sunk cost fallacy isn't just an economic concept, it's a military killer. The resources already committed shouldn't determine whether to commit more. Yet, human psychology makes withdrawal psychologically harder than continuation, even when continuation guarantees disaster. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're principles that transcend eras and technologies. When modern military academies study impossible victories, whether Thermopylae, Agincourt, or the Battle of Britain, they see Constantinople's shadow. The siege proved that sometimes, just sometimes, cunning counts more than counting. The siege saved a civilization, but it couldn't save the men who fought it from their own destinies. What happened to Leo the liar and Maslama the sword reveals the cruel ironies of history. Leo III's later reign demonstrated that military genius doesn't guarantee wisdom in all domains. Byzantine sources document his continued successful defense against subsequent Arab attacks. His Isaurian dynasty ruled until 802, providing stable leadership that helped the empire recover from the 20 years' anarchy. But his legacy was forever complicated by what he initiated. In 726, the iconoclast controversy, the banning of religious images he believed constituted idolatry, sparked a theological civil war that lasted over a century. Icons were destroyed across the empire. Monasteries that resisted were suppressed. Families split over whether image veneration constituted worship or blasphemy. The unity that the siege victory had created was shattered by Leo's religious policy. He died of natural causes on June 18th, 741, at age 56, having saved his empire militarily, only to divide it theologically. Historical assessment of Leo remains complex. He was undeniably a brilliant tactician whose cunning and strategic vision saved Constantinople. His exploitation of Greek fire, his alliance with Tervel, his use of Coptic defection, intelligence, all demonstrated military genius. Yet his religious policies caused damage that arguably rivaled what Arab armies could have inflicted. The emperor who preserved Byzantine civilization also wounded it profoundly. Maslama's final years carry a different tragedy. Arab chronicles document that he continued military service after the Constantinople disaster. He led campaigns, governed provinces, served the caliphate faithfully, but his reputation never recovered. The man who had been called the Sword of Islam, who had spent decades conquering Byzantine fortresses, who had seemed invincible, would forever be remembered for the greatest military catastrophe in early Islamic history. He died in 738, his name permanently associated with catastrophic defeat rather than earlier victories. Think about that cruel irony. Decades of success erased by 1 year of failure. Every fortress he'd conquered, every battle he'd won, overshadowed by the siege where 100,000 became 30,000. The memory divide illustrates how history is remembered differently by different cultures. Western Europe largely forgot this siege. Unlike the Battle of Tours in 732, which remained in Western historical consciousness, Constantinople's 717 to 718 faded from Western European awareness. The battle was too far away, involved forces most Western Europeans never encountered, and didn't directly impact their territories. Byzantine tradition remembered it as divine miracle, Orthodox Christianity's collective memory emphasized the Virgin Mary's protection. The walls that never fell, the winter that destroyed enemies, the fire that defended the faithful. The siege became religious narrative as much as military history. Islamic tradition remembered it as catastrophic loss. Arab historians had to grapple with explaining how the largest military expedition in Islamic history had ended in near total annihilation. The theological implications, the seeming withdrawal of divine favor at a critical moment, created interpretive challenges that Islamic scholarship addressed for generations. Modern historical recognition of the battle's importance is relatively recent. Only in the past few centuries have Western historians fully appreciated the siege's macro-historical significance. Military historians studying medieval warfare now consistently rank it among history's most decisive battles. The scholarly consensus recognizes what contemporary Western Europeans missed. This siege altered the trajectory of civilizations. Both Leo and Maslama believed God fought on their side. Both were wrong, or both were right. Or perhaps the question itself misses the point. What historical sources verify is this: in 717, faith met faith, empire met empire, and the impossible happened. So why should you care about a siege fought 1,307 years ago between empires that no longer exist? Because the lessons transcend time, technology, and circumstance. When modern militaries study impossible victories, they see patterns that echo through centuries. Pattern 1. Technological superiority can overcome numerical disadvantage. A lesson as relevant in the age of Greek fire as in modern warfare. The Byzantines didn't match Arab numbers, they couldn't, but Greek fire gave them a force multiplier that turned 20,000 defenders into the equivalent of 100,000 attackers. Modern parallels are obvious: precision-guided munitions, stealth technology, cyber warfare capabilities. The principle remains constant. Technology can rewrite strategic calculus overnight. Pattern 2. Intelligence and betrayal can be decisive. The Coptic defection changed the siege's outcome as profoundly as any battle. Modern intelligence services understand what Leo understood in 718. Information about enemy positions, capabilities, and intentions can be more valuable than additional divisions. The lesson cuts both ways. Forces that rely on conscription or coercion create potential defection points that enemies can exploit. Pattern 3. Environmental factors operate independently of human will. The winter and volcanic eruptions killed without regard to faith or righteousness. Modern militaries call this environmental conditions or acts of God, but the reality is the same. Napoleon in Russia, Hitler in Stalingrad, Kublai Khan's invasion fleets destroyed by typhoons. History is littered with campaigns that failed because commanders didn't account for weather, terrain, or natural disasters. Pattern 4. Supply and morale determine outcomes as much as combat. Constantinople maintained both, while the besiegers lost both. Modern military logistics emphasizes this constantly. An army marches on its stomach. Soldiers who are fed, warm, and confident will fight. Soldiers who are starving, frozen, and demoralized will break regardless of numerical superiority. Pattern 5. Alliances force multiplication. Bulgarian horse archers didn't outnumber the Arabs. They didn't need to. Swift mobile warfare against exhausted siege troops achieved strategic effects disproportionate to their numbers. Modern NATO doctrine, alliance warfare, coalition operations, all based on the principle that coordinated action by smaller forces can defeat larger enemies. Pattern 6. Sunk costs are psychological traps. Maslama stayed months after any rational assessment said retreat. Modern behavioral economics calls this sunk cost fallacy the tendency to continue investing in failing ventures because of resources already committed. Military commanders still fall into this trap. Political leaders definitely do. The lesson from 718. Sometimes the hardest decision is admitting failure and cutting losses. Pattern 7. Deception remains the ultimate force multiplier. Leo's lies worked because Meslama expected honesty. The grain deception at Amorium, the false promise of tributary status, the exploitation of Arab assumptions about Byzantine weakness. Modern military doctrine still teaches: deceive, distract, confuse, make the enemy fight the battle you want, not the one they planned. Think about how these principles apply beyond warfare. In business, startups with superior technology defeat established competitors with more resources. In sports, teams with better coaching and morale beat teams with superior talent. In politics, alliances and information matter more than size. The siege of Constantinople proves something that echoes through every competitive domain. Intelligence, preparation, technological advantage, and psychological warfare can overcome raw numerical superiority. 20,000 defeated, 100,000 because they were smarter, better equipped, more motivated, and willing to exploit every advantage, technological, environmental, and psychological. That's not just history. That's the eternal lesson about how unlikely victories become reality. Let's return to the numbers that opened this story. In August 717, contemporary sources document that over 100,000 warriors and 1,800 ships surrounded Constantinople, a city defended by perhaps 20,000 men. Modern historians still debate exact figures, but the impossible disparity is undeniable. Yet by August 718, fewer than 30,000 invaders survived to reach home. The arithmetic of annihilation defies belief, but sources from both sides confirm it. No single factor decided this siege. That's what makes it so fascinating and so instructive. This wasn't Greek fire alone, or winter alone, or Bulgarian intervention alone. It was convergence, the simultaneous occurrence of multiple advantages that created impossibility. Chronicles document Leo's cunning deception at Amorium months before the siege. Byzantine sources describe Greek fire's terror, a technological secret that made the sea burn. Theophanes records winter's unprecedented severity, 100 days of snow, the Bosphorus, freezing. Historical accounts verify the Coptic defection that revealed the relief fleet's location. Sources confirm Bulgarian intervention that turned besiegers into besieged. Natural disasters, volcanic eruption, massive storms destroyed the retreating fleet. It was tactics, technology, weather, betrayal, allies, and volcanic fire. Every element necessary, none sufficient alone. Think about what had to happen for Constantinople to survive. Leo had to seize power in March 717, 3 months before the siege. His usurpation had to succeed bloodlessly so the city wasn't divided when Arabs arrived. The grain deception at Amorium had to work so Meslama's rear was compromised. Greek fire technology had to exist and remain secret. The Byzantines had to deploy it effectively in September against the First Fleet, and again in May against the Relief Fleet. Arab ships had to cluster near the walls, a tactical error born of unfamiliarity with Bosphorus currents. Winter, 717 to 718, had to be one of the most severe in European history. Not just cold, but sustained cold. 100+ days of snow in a Mediterranean climate. Cold severe, enough to freeze the Bosphorus. Coptic sailors had to choose religious solidarity over forced loyalty. They had to defect at precisely the right moment, after the relief fleet arrived, but before it could deliver supplies. They had to provide accurate intelligence about ship locations. Khan Tervel had to honor his alliance with Leo despite the risks. Bulgarian cavalry had to employ mobile warfare effectively against Arab siege lines. The harassment had to be sustained for months. And finally, as if all that weren't enough, nature had to cooperate one more time. A volcanic eruption near Santorini during the retreat. A massive storm in the Aegean. The combination destroying 95% of the remaining fleet. Remove any single element, and Constantinople probably falls. The deception fails. Maslama's supply lines are secure. Greek fire doesn't work. The Bosphorus is blockaded. The winter is normal. Arabs maintain supplies and morale. Copts stay loyal. The relief fleet delivers desperately needed provisions. Bulgarians don't intervene. Foraging continues and the siege sustains itself. No volcanic eruption. Most of the fleet escapes. But all of it happened. Every element aligned. Every advantage activated. And 100,000 became 30,000. Both Leo and Maslama believed God fought on their side. Both were certain of divine favor. Both saw this conflict in cosmic terms, where human agency served supernatural purpose. Theophanes records Byzantine conviction that their walls had never fallen because divine protection made them unconquerable. Arab sources reveal Islamic confidence that their expansion had never failed because Allah's will drove them forward. In August 717, these two theological certainties collided with physical reality. What happened next reveals something profound about the relationship between faith and facts, between belief and outcome, between what we think determines events and what actually does. The Byzantines believed the Virgin Mary protected them. They prayed before icons, paraded sacred images on the walls, maintained constant vigils in the Hagia Sophia. When they survived, it seemed to confirm everything faith had promised. But then earthquakes struck. Volcanic eruptions continued. The very natural disasters that had destroyed their enemies now ravaged their own territories. If God favored them, why the continued suffering? Leo's answer that icon veneration was actually idolatry that angered God created a century of religious civil war. The theological certainty that sustained them through the siege couldn't survive the complexities of peace. The Muslims believed Constantinople's conquest was prophetically ordained. Islamic expansion had been unstoppable for decades. Allah's favor seemed manifest in every victory from Spain to India. When 100,000 warriors couldn't take one city defended by 20,000, theological crisis resulted. If God willed their expansion, how could this happen? Unknown sins? Withdrawn divine favor? Misunderstood prophecy? Arab chroniclers struggled to reconcile faith in divine destiny with empirical catastrophe. The intellectual crisis matched the military disaster. Modern historians see something different, a convergence of tactical decisions, technological advantages, environmental factors, and strategic errors. Greek fire was chemistry, not miracle. Winter was meteorology, not divine punishment. Bulgarian intervention was alliance politics, not supernatural intervention. The volcanic eruption, geology. The Coptic defection, human choice motivated by religious identity and forced conscription resentment. Leo's deception, ancient cunning applied with modern stakes. But here's what's fascinating. All three interpretations, Byzantine, Islamic, and modern, contain truth. The Byzantines were right, that their survival depended on factors beyond their military strength. Greek fire, winter, volcanic eruptions, Bulgarian allies. None of these were resources they created through planning alone. The Muslims were right, that their defeat revealed something fundamental about the limits of military power. The largest force ever assembled couldn't overcome defenders who controlled technology, terrain, and tactical initiative. Modern historians are right that analyzing specific decisions and environmental factors explains the outcome better than appealing to divine intervention. Yet there's something the modern analysis misses. The faith that sustained defenders through a year of siege was as real and as tactically relevant as Greek fire. Byzantine morale, maintained through religious conviction, was a military asset as tangible as the Theodosian walls. Islamic confidence born from theological certainty made the campaign possible, but also made strategic errors more likely. When you believe God guarantees victory, you're less likely to question tactical decisions or retreat when prudent. Faith shaped decisions on both sides. Those decisions had consequences that determined outcomes. Attempting to separate belief from tactics, theology from strategy, misses how these elements interacted. In the end, Constantinople's survival came down to a simple, impossible fact that all three worldviews must address. Sometimes 20,000 can defeat 100,000. History proved it. Sources documented it. And Western civilization exists because of it. So here we are, 1,307 years after August, 717 AD. What does the siege of Constantinople actually mean? What should we remember about a battle that saved a civilization most people have never heard of? We should remember this: 100,000 warriors with 1,800 ships thought God had promised them Constantinople. They had every military advantage: numbers, supplies, momentum, experience. They had prophecy, wealth, and confidence, born from decades of unbroken conquest. They faced 20,000 defenders behind walls, commanded by an emperor who'd seized power through lies just months earlier. The mathematics said Constantinople would fall. The precedent said Islamic expansion was unstoppable. The faith on both sides said God would decide. Then Greek fire made the sea burn. Winter froze the Bosphorus. Coptic Christians chose religious solidarity over forced loyalty. Bulgarian cavalry turned siege lines into death traps, and volcanic eruptions destroyed the retreating fleet. By August 718, fewer than 30,000 of the original 200,000 who'd committed to this campaign made it home alive. It wasn't a defeat, it was annihilation. The largest military expedition in Islamic history had been destroyed by deception, technology, weather, betrayal, and geology. If this story changed how you think about impossible odds, technological advantage, or the power of strategic deception, hit that subscribe button, because there are dozens more stories like this. Battles where the unlikely defeated the inevitable. Moments where technology rewrote history. Sieges where cunning trumped numbers. Drop a comment. What shocked you most? That Leo lied his way to saving civilization? That Greek fire made water burn? That winter killed more than combat? That Coptic sailors defected and destroyed the relief fleet? That a volcanic eruption annihilated the retreating navy? That only 30,000 of 200,000 survived? Share this video with someone facing impossible odds. Someone who needs to understand that numerical superiority doesn't guarantee victory. That technology and tactics can overcome raw power. That sometimes, just sometimes, 20,000 can defeat 100,000 if they're smarter, better equipped, and willing to exploit every advantage. Because that's the eternal lesson of Constantinople. Cunning counts more than counting. Technology trumps numbers. Deception defeats strength. And sometimes the impossible becomes real, because one emperor was willing to lie, burn, and endure winter to save his stolen throne. August 717, 100,000 warriors, 1,800 ships. The greatest invasion force the medieval world had ever seen. August 718, fewer than 30,000 survivors, perhaps 5 ships returning home. The worst military disaster in early Islamic history. 1 year, 1 city, 1 emperor who saved Western civilization through lies, fire, and winter. Now you know why the battles nobody remembers sometimes matter more than the famous ones everyone knows. Why technological secrets can change the course of empires. Why faith and facts collide in ways that shape civilizations. Why sometimes Against every probability, the walls stand and the impossible happens. I'll see you in the next one, where we'll explore another moment when someone refused to accept defeat and changed history through intelligence and innovation. Until then, remember Constantinople. Remember Leo. Remember that sometimes the liar saves the world, the fire burns on water, and winter decides the fate of civilizations. And remember that in 717, 1,800 ships came to destroy a city. In 718, only 5 went home. History proved it. Sources documented it, and Western civilization exists because of it.